Hello, ARC podcast listeners. If you were sitting there thinking to yourself that what you were really missing in your life was another interview podcast from another middle-aged male member of Mark's family of origin, then have I got a treat for you. This is Dan Oppenheimer, brother of Mark and host of Eminent Americans, a podcast about the contemporary American intellectual scene, which has now joined the ARC podcast family. I talk in real depth and with as much humanity as I can muster to the people who are shaping and analyzing the political, cultural, and intellectual world in which we all live, breathe, love, and hate, and I have a blast doing it. Recent and upcoming episodes feature conversations with novelist Sheila Heti on her therapeutic journey into psychedelics, computer scientist Tuin Chakraborty on whether and how AI can emulate our greatest writers, and sociologist Rogers Brubaker on his new book on gender identity. It's a podcast that values both intellectual depth and human depth. We talk about ideas not just for their own sake, but for how they matter to us as real human people with complex psyches and profound imperfections. If this sounds like your jam, come find me at Apple, Spotify, on my Substack, and at arcmag.org. That's ARCMAG.org. I look forward to encountering you. Now back to the older, more godly, but slightly less handsome Oppenheimer.
I'm Mark Oppenheimer, and this is ARC, the podcast. It's the podcast companion to the web magazine ARC, Religion, Politics, Etc., which is a production of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. This week, I interview, well, before I tell you whom I interview, let me do it through a story. When I was about 14 years old, I must have been at Edwards Bookstore in Bay State West, the downtown mall in Springfield, Massachusetts, that is sadly now defunct, or at least changed beyond recognition. Normally, when in such a bookstore, I might be looking for a paperback, maybe one of the Fletch novels by Gregory MacDonald, maybe something by Agatha Christie, or one of the James Bond books by Ian Fleming. But somehow, on this day, the book that caught my eye was a hardcover nonfiction book, obviously in the adult section, called The Promised Land. The Promised Land, I learned from the jacket copy, was about the great African-American migration from the Mississippi Delta and the South up to the North, principally Chicago, in the years between the wars. Now, this has been written about since, and it had been written about before, but the book The Promised Land by Nicholas Lemann, which at the time I thought was pronounced Lemann, was my introduction to this important American story. Now, I don't know why I wanted this book. As I said, even as a fairly bookish, intellectually curious 14-year-old, I wasn't in the habit of asking my parents to shell out $19.95 for a 400-page book of journalism or nonfiction history. I really wanted escapism. But something about this book called out to me, and it proved to be the first serious adult nonfiction book that I would ever read. And of course, it was followed by many more books, and I ended up being somebody who wrote such books. But for that introduction to serious nonfiction, I have to thank the journalist Nicholas Lemann. Again, Lemann, Lemann. I now know, as a grown-up nonfiction writer, that he is one of our finest writers. He has for many years written for The New Yorker and many other publications. He was for a time the dean of the Columbia Journalism School. And now he is somebody whom I hope I might call a friend, or at least a friendly acquaintance, and somebody who I hope is auditioning me to be a friend. His new book is called Returning, A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries, and it's about his family's history as one of the founding Jewish families of New Orleans. As you'll hear from this interview, I have a particular personal interest in stories like this because my father's family was one of the founding Jewish families of Pittsburgh, and they, like the Lemann family, have over the generations faced questions about America, patriotism, belonging, assimilation, and the lure of the mainstream dominant Gentile Christianity. So as you can hear, this interview with Nicholas Lemann got pretty personal at times, and it also included discussion of his growing attachment to Jewish religious practice and observance, which is also something that I find interesting and have had some of myself. So I hope that the interview plays to you as meaningfully and enjoyably as it was for me to record. And I invite you to sit back with a mint julep and maybe some Cajun food and listen to Nick Lemann talk about his New Orleans family as described in his book, Returning, A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries. I just reread the book. I read it when I got it a little while ago and then reread it over the past couple of days. The book is Returning, A Search for Home Across Three Centuries. And I think it's really good, but I'm actually the worst possible critic of it because it's as if you were writing my family's story. And so it felt so absurdly close to home in so many ways that, my whatever objective perspective I would have was completely vanished or vanquished by the fact that it was a very meaningful and moving book for me to read because I thought, oh my God, I know these people so well. And of course, I don't actually know your mom and dad or your ancestors that well, but I feel like I get them in all sorts of ways that I'll probably get into.
So in terms of categories, subcategories, are you Southern and German or one or the other or both?
Yeah. So my father's family was to Pittsburgh what the Lemanns were to New Orleans, which is they got there in their case, the early 1840s. And I think they were somewhat, well, this might be a Pittsburgh, New Orleans difference. Pittsburgh, of course, had a lot of Jews and had the whole range from Orthodox to totally secular. And so to plant oneself as Reformed Jews at Rodef Sholem was less, it was more okay to be a little more conspicuously Jewish than it was in New Orleans, I think.
That is confirmed by my son who lives in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And I don't think the full gentleman's agreement swing back to anti-Semitism happened in the 30s and 40s and 50s in Pittsburgh the way that in New Orleans, while you'd had ancestors who could get into certain clubs in the 1910s or 20s, by the 40s and 50s the door had swung shut, which is of course also what happened in the Ivy League. And that wasn't true in Pittsburgh. So there was a little more affiliation and a little more pride, but not much. And my father's mother was from Lake Charles, Louisiana, and went to Sophie Newcomb. And her brother ended up writing for the Times-Picayune for decades. And so she had the full boat of the Southern stuff on top of the German Jewish stuff. And this was my grandma, whom I knew, and I think was profoundly uncomfortable in ways that some of your relatives were really quite profoundly uncomfortable. So she married my grandfather and moved up to Pittsburgh and became part of that world. It was a very German Jewish world, but it was a Jewish world in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. I have to say, if I can digress, I'm sure you've been to Falling Water.
Is that the Frank Lloyd Wright house?
Yeah.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah. I went there a while ago and I just had this total epiphany. I'm among my people now. Because, when you go in the house, there's like a million books about psychoanalysis,
right.
A million books about modern art, no books about Jews.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many permutations of this. And the way that when you got to Harvard and met Jews who liked being Jewish, you're 20 years older than I am, but that was exactly my experience of going to Yale College in the early 90s. Even though I'd grown up in Western Massachusetts, not New Orleans. So it was a very different thing. But these questions about belonging and ownership and assimilation and passing also are just really interesting. And my family had a lot of this, had analogs to all of them. But we'll get into that. This is about you and your book. Why don't you tell us what the book's about?
The sort of origin story of the book, in a way, is I have a large extended family that has been living in Louisiana for the last 190 years, having come from Germany. And evidently, they never throw much away. So one of my many, many, many cousins, a generation or two older than me, who was a professor at Tulane, gathered a bunch of family records and papers back in the late 50s and early 60s and deposited them at Tulane. So it's a really big archive. You've worked in archives before?
Yeah.
So the metric is linear feet.
Right.
So this is about like 125 linear feet of material going back to the early 19th century and even earlier in some instances. So I embarked on my life journey, and as I look back, I think I was circling around this material the whole time because I kept doing projects on Southern history, archives, things like that. But I made a big point of I'm never going to look in this archive, which is publicly available. And then I got to a certain age, and I thought, as a journalist, leave aside everything else. Just like, don't be an idiot and never look at this material. It's a huge trove, and don't you want to know what's in there? So I decided it was time to kind of, step up to the plate and look at this stuff. And then I spent a lot of time researching this history. And that's the story I tell in the book. I didn't just work in this one archive. I worked in a number of other archives. I went back to Germany, to the village my family comes from. And I was able to tell, a 5 or 6 generation story at a pretty high level of detail, going back into the 1830s and 40s, which is not a lot of people can do, but that's what I was able to do because of this material.
The family gets to America in the 1830s, right? And is your great-great-great-grandfather the first Jew in New Orleans or the first German Jew? Like, how big is the community when he gets there?
Not very, but so there's a book called Early Jews of New Orleans by a rabbi no longer with us named Bertram Korn. And
this, by the way, can sit on my bookshelf next to the book my father's family has, which is Notable Jews of Western Pennsylvania, which is like going back to colonial times.
But our family didn't even make the cut for Early Jews of New Orleans because everybody in that book is Sephardic. So sort of slightly marquee names in the Jewish world, like Judah P. Benjamin and Judah Turo. These are Sephardic, not German Jews.
Right.
And by the time my great-great-grandfather arrived in 1836, I guess New Orleans had a few hundred Jews. The German Jews were the greenhorns compared to the Sephardic Jews. But the point is, 2 points that are important about this particular Jewish migration. And some of your listeners and viewers may have seen the Lemann trilogy, has a kind of similar storyline, at least the first act does. So these migrants came from Germany, usually southwestern Germany. They didn't come as whole families. They came as single men, bachelors. And they didn't settle in cities. They tended to start as peddlers and find a small town to put down their backpack in. And then the dream was, I want to start a dry goods store in a small town. And then everything kind of flowed from there. So that was the story of my family. So my great-great-grandfather arrived in New Orleans, but he did not stay in New Orleans. He went to a town called Donaldsonville. And that's where the family has been living for 190 years.
By the time you get to your grandfather, who was the oldest generation whom you knew, you didn't know your great-grandfather, is my recollection.
No, he died in 1899. So.
But you knew your grandpa, you knew Pop, and you knew your dad, you knew Father. What was their relationship to their Judaism? In what ways were they Jewish? How did they feel Jewish or not? What did they claim? What did they disown?
Yeah, so my father and my grandfather were actually quite different. And what this gets to is, in my view at least, I don't know if you agree, German Jews are no longer a meaningful category in Jewish America. They're just not, or they're sort of like a secret category. We can recognize each other. But German Jewish America existed as a very coherent culture, roughly from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, and then it dissipated, mostly because of assimilation, I think. So my grandfather's life was, he was born in 1884 and he died in 1959. So his life was exactly coterminous with the heyday of German Jewish America. So he was able to live in an entirely German Jewish world. All of his friends were German Jews. There was this whole German Jewish civilization. And one of the ways it developed is it was actually became very, very secular, because you could be sort of culturally German Jewish and not have to do very much Jewish. My grandfather was at at an extreme of the German Jews. As you know, if you bring up the subject of German Jews among Eastern European German Jews of a certain age, you're opening a vein.
Yes.
Because we, the German Jews, were not beloved by the Ostjuden, to say the least. My grandfather, compared to the rest of us, has a pretty good record. He did not belong to the somewhat notorious American Council for Judaism. He actively supported,
which was anti-Zionist and highly assimilationist, just for people who don't know it, and is making a weird small comeback.
Yes,
apparently.
It sure is. And he was he testified in Congress in favor of the Wagner bill to import, relax immigration restrictions and import German refugee children to America.
Right.
He was very close friends with Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was a lifelong Zionist. So he was kind of more in the Zionist lane, and he was more. German Jews tended to be sort of establishment liberal, and he was maybe a little more liberal than establishment liberal without being in any way radical, especially on civil rights issues. But I wouldn't call him assimilated in the sense that, when he went to any social occasion, every single person there would be a German Jew,
Right.
But by the time my father came along, born in 1926, that world really didn't exist so much anymore. I think he could have found his way into it, but he didn't want to. So he had the dream of kind of social acceptance into the, I don't want to say WASP, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because in New Orleans, the social elite was Catholic, but he wanted to be an accepted member in the non-Jewish and actually anti-Semitic New Orleans social elite. So that was kind of his project.
And I want to stop here for a second, because that was really interesting to me, because the typical story is, and maybe by typical, I just mean my family, but I don't think so. The more typical story is, and I think this may have to do with different cities, but in a lot of cities, the generation born in the late 1800s that came up, that was highly German Jewish, a lot of them were escaping into being Episcopalians, or, they wanted their children to intermarry. They were really the least out Jews. That was the least openly Jewish generation. And by the time you get to people who are living, who are serving in World War II and, living in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's, a little more acceptance of being American Jews. If they haven't assimilated out, you see a little more pride, especially after World War II. I mean, the thing your father did, which was double down on the Germanness and the kind of deracinated anti-Judaism, to double down on that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a somewhat anachronistic and peculiar thing. It was a time when even German Jews were, again, as you said, German wasn't really a category, and if they were going to be Jewish, they were going to take some interest in Israel, take some interest in kind of the influence of the mass Eastern immigration into culture, into the movies, into the arts, etc. But he doubled down on the kind of abstemious Germanness of it all, which is just really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be partly just him and partly a New Orleans thing. I'm sure you know the book Our Crowd by Stephen Birmingham.
I've never read it, but I've certainly possessed it and seen it on many bookshelves.
Well, one thing that's interesting, it's a book about German Jews by a non-Jew. Right. And it was a sensational bestseller when it came out in the late 60s. And so, first of all, German Jews were on people's radar screen enough for the book to be a sensational bestseller, which would not be true today. But he ends by saying, this is a group that isn't going to exist for very much longer because of assimilation. It's true that for instance, American Council of Judaism that we talked about a minute ago fell apart after the 1967 war in Israel because it became sort of okay to be Zionist. So with the German Jews, some of them moved in that direction. I know a lot of these people now. Many more of them are just not Jewish anymore than kind of returned to Judaism. And also, well, my grandfather, his name was Montefiore Mordecai Lemon. He was born in 1884, and he was named after Sir Moses Montefiore and Mordecai in the Book of Esther. So that's pretty Jewish, right?
Right.
And he had this kind of loyalty to the Jewish people that my father didn't have nearly as much. So I take your point, but it's a little bit different from that story.
At one point in the book, you say something that really I thought was quite profound and beautiful and recognizable to me, which is you said father was interested in objects, mom was interested in people. And to me and to my siblings, I think when we look at our parents' marriage, which is between a German Jew and my mother, who was the daughter of, granddaughter of Eastern European immigrants, and her parents were communists, and it was a very different story.
Sounds like Tony Kushner, who's from Lake Charles.
Yeah, well, and my grandmother was confirmed in the same temple. Her picture is like a few pictures on the wall before you get to Tony Kushner's. I've been there. Yeah, exactly. And Lake Charles, of course, is sort of famous and is in the culture in various ways. Alfred Urey has it in a play, and all that. So, but that difference between being interested in objects and people, I mean, your father obviously became a very passionate collector. He was more interested in objects than most humans of any ethnicity. But the fact that your mother would do that thing where she'd look at a couple and say, they're not going to be married in 3 years,
Yeah.
And just that general interest in psychology, it's certainly not genetically the case that Ostjuden were interested in psychology, and of course, Freud was not, he was a cultured Viennese Jew, but that interest in people and inner life and psychology has always struck me as one of the really interesting divides, because part of what the German Jews were emulating unintentionally in WASP culture was a sort of repressed unwillingness to look at human psychology.
Right.
And that was not an inhibition of Eastern European Jewish immigrants for whatever reason. I don't really want, one would have to get into almost metaphysical claims to figure out what's going on there. It would be very hard to trace the genealogy of that distinction. But your mother was actually interested in people. And I got the sense that when you got to Harvard and met a lot of more Jewish Jews, part of the conversation that you were drawn to was this interest in the inner lives of people.
Right. And just, I don't think the high German Jews' emulation of high WASPs was completely unconscious. I think some of it was conscious. There was a sense of, there was a very iterated sense in our minds of behaviors, thought patterns, etc., that would read as too Jewish, and that was what we wouldn't do.
So, for listeners who are utterly unaware of this lost world of German Jewry, you talk about this in the book. But what are some of the things that would have been too Jewish that your father had trained himself or been trained to avoid? How was one supposed to be?
Let's see. It's a long, long list.
Oh, good.
Never talk about Israel or Zionism. That would be one. We didn't go to, when I was a child, we were taken to services one day a year, and that was Thanksgiving, because it was a universalism is the key. Universalism versus particularism. A version of being Jewish that's truly universalist. So wouldn't celebrate Jewish holidays. Wouldn't the phrase, "Is it good for the Jews?" could never be spoken, even in the privacy of your own home. The phrase, "Is he Jewish?" could never be spoken, because you weren't supposed to think about things like that. And then, I hate to stray into cliches and stereotypes, but, you could never, ever talk about money, and you wouldn't talk about like your body and parts of your body and how they were, the so-called organ recital. That's something we wouldn't do. But, one of the ironies is, in my view at least, as the German Jewish culture, which was so powerful and strong at one time, doesn't exist anymore, I think the high WASP culture also pretty much doesn't exist anymore,
Right.
in much, much less diminished form. So it's very, very hard to recreate the admiration that people held for, people from kind of old families that came over on the Mayflower, and the sort of style of living that they had perfected. People like that were just extravagantly admired back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in a way that they're just not now. They've gone underground.
Well, they've gone underground, but they've also, I think, and this is just a mirror of what you said about German Jewry. The work of living in America and marrying whom you want ultimately does its work. I remember even 30 or 40 years ago, to say nothing of my father went to a prep school in Pittsburgh. He went to Shadyside Academy.
Yeah.
And so he was one of 3 Jews in his class or something. And I went to a New England prep school and the school was maybe 10% Jewish. But if you look at the kind of WASPs I went to high school with, there were still a lot who were from families like the ones my dad went to high school with in the early 60s. I mean, you still, when you met somebody who was a Rockefeller or a Roosevelt or a Havemeyer or you mentioned the novelist, or an Auchincloss. We had one of the, they were still coming from families that if you met their parents, you saw what was going on there. It was a different culture.
Yeah.
My daughter is now at my old high school. It's completely gone. I mean, even those families, even if the last name persists, the moms are in the same Lululemon jeggings and the dads are in the same golf clothes, and they still, and what even surprised me, and here we're getting deep into stereotypes, is even the aesthetic. Like some of the families who still have the money and have the lineage, they'll buy a big McMansion. They'll just buy a big ugly new development, unaware that their grandparents would have been horrified. I mean, the whole conversation around class, that Paul Fussell wrote about, that Lewis Lapham wrote about, it's collapsed. The reference points are gone.
Yeah.
And it's happened in the past 20 or 30 years. You could still see so much more of it even in the late 90s. And of course, Trump is its death knell in some ways, because we now have a president who, by those old WASP or German Jewish standards, has zero taste, zero class, whatever. And he pays it's not even part of the conversation. If you dislike him, it's not for those reasons. There's so many other reasons.
Yeah. So the German Jews were emulating a group that was itself on the way out. And so we sort of followed them. The very end of our crowd, Stephen Birmingham says, these German Jews are giving their kids first names like Peters or Bradford.
Right.
Come on. And I don't think anybody, even WASPs, don't give their kids names like that anymore, per what
That's
you were
right.
saying. But let me try something else out on you, which I've begun to think lately, which is we're now in this very resonant moment in Jewish America. And to some extent, I think a lot of liberal Eastern European descended Jews are like the new German Jews. They're having some of the same agonies that we were having back in the 1930s, because it has this structure of, we found our place in the United States and had 3 or 4 essential touch points and felt very, very comfortable. And now suddenly it's not comfortable anymore. And what do we do? So there's this kind of identity crisis going on.
I think that's right. And I think that for a lot of those liberal establishment Jews, it's that they thought that a kind of coherent liberal politics and liberal Zionism would persist. And of course, it's also embedded in certain institutions they came to know and like and trust, local federations, Jewish community centers, and all of those institutions and institutional beliefs now seem to be under attack from the non-Jews have come back to attack them, and then their own children are coming back to attack them. And so, I mean, it's when I think
I
of
just add to that, there's a kind of a part of the package which has been written about a lot, is what developed over the decades was the sense that you can have a sort of comfortable Jewish identity that's sort of like culturally Jewish. You don't really have to do very much at all religiously. And in some ways, you're substituting liberal Zionism for observance.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that all blows up, you sort of don't have a place to go psychologically.
I've come to the conclusion, and I'm curious if you have too, that there is no persisting or stable Jewish identity, or even a happy one, without some connection to the texts.
I absolutely agree. I could not agree more. And it's so interesting. I mean, writing this book and having it published has been a fascinating experience because I feel like I'm, America's Jewish group therapist or something. I just get
Join the
all
club, man.
these letters from people all the time.
Welcome.
And they're in various subcategories, but one of the subcategories is, I hear you, I your story is very meaningful to me, but I will never go to shul ever.
Right.
Sorry, that's off the table. And I say to these people, why is that? And they say,
what's your theory on that? Because I see that, and what's interesting is, let me go even further on that. A lot of them, like your cousin who became a Quaker, uncle, who became a Quaker, but then of course the world had its revenge because his son became a Haredi Jew with 38 grandchildren. But a lot of them they are not all hardcore secularists. Like, this is what's been interesting to me is one of the things I grew up with in my family archetypes was the secular side. They were real communists. They were real rationalists. They didn't do spirituality. They didn't do woo. They wouldn't do alternative medicine. They wouldn't be getting a doula today. Like, they were real scientists. I mean, they weren't scientists, but they were scientistic in their worldview. But a lot of the people you're talking about today who are writing you letters, and these people are endemic in journalism in our guild, they sent their kids to Quaker school. And then they were excited when their kids went to Quaker college, to Haverford or Bryn Mawr, or their kids went to Georgetown. They said, they love the Jesuits. Like, they're not allergic to all spirituality, only their own. And they didn't grow up with your dad and that level of sort of, self-censorship or whatever it was. I want to get back to him. It came from somewhere else. Like, they weren't all tortured by Hebrew school. A lot of them didn't go to Hebrew school. But they still feel like a Jewish service would somehow, religious worship service would be anathema. Do you have a theory on this? What's going on with these people?
A few things. So one is, at least in my experience, like my younger kids went to Heschel, a Jewish day school.
Yeah.
And it sort of started at least as, the liberal Jewish day school that was founded by a member of SNCC from the 60s. And you go to the school, the very first, parents whose kids are starting preschool, there's this welcome video, and it's hosted by Cornel West. Welcome to Heschel. That would not happen anymore, obviously.
Right.
But
it's an old video.
Yeah.
It was made 15 years ago, but okay.
But so you go there and you go to Grandparents' Day, and you're very invested. I found this way to be, sort of this Jewish observant world that's, liberal. And then you go to Grandparents' Day, and over here is Abe Foxman, and over there is Norman Podhoretz. And, the point is, when you enter the observant Jewish world, observant at all, you have entered a politically diverse space, in my experience. And that's a good thing. That's what we all say we want. But if
Right.
you have it in your head that I'm a liberal Jew, and then you do something in a religious space and you're around quote unquote neocons, I'm not supposed to be around these people. So that's number one. And number two is a lot of people feel, I don't know what's going on. I'm among people who whose Jewish skills are so much higher than mine that I feel sort of vaguely humiliated. I mean, to use your example, and I know a lot of people like this because I live in a university, I am an expert. I'm getting these, in the pre-Trump days at least, NIH grants 24/7.
Right.
I live in a world of expertise, and then I walk into shul and I have no idea what's going on.
I'm totally at sea. I'm lost.
You lose your sense of mastery and control that you're used to. And then, in the two worlds I live in, which is journalism and academia, they're overwhelmingly secular. I had an epiphany moment when Columbia, this is years ago, Columbia was opening a center in Istanbul. And we sent a delegation of fairly high-level people led by the then president of the university. After this happened, we went for a nice, relaxed dinner. And it came out during the dinner that I was the only one of 20 people there who actually was a dues-paying member of a religious congregation. And not only that, when people heard that about me, they said, really? It's like they almost said, you seem so normal. And then I start getting these questions like, well, do you go to the doctor when you're sick? And, um, so
which also, by the way, attests to the collapse of mainline
exactly,
Protestantism,
yeah.
because 50 years ago, a lot of those people would have been, casual, occasional members of the Episcopal Church or the Congregational Church or whatever. And now it's any house of worship. In fact, in New Haven, almost all the people I know who are dues-paying members of the congregation are Jews.
Me too. Absolutely.
Either my congregation or right. Like, try finding someone who goes to a liberal Lutheran church or the Congregational Church. You can't find them.
I went to so this incident in Istanbul happened. So I came back home to Morningside Heights, and I went to sort of have a confrontation with, no longer with us, my beloved former book editor through 3 long book projects, Elizabeth Sifton, daughter of Reinhold Niebuhr, who she adored, and wrote a book about how much she adored him. And I said, Elizabeth, do you belong to a congregation? She said, of course not. What do you think I am? And it just struck me as so interesting that, and I said, do you know anybody who belongs to it? No, of course not.
That's so funny. Paul Eli does.
Yeah.
I mean, she worked with a Catholic.
Yeah. There's a few people.
But other than that, there's a few people. That
norm just changed. And, in the neighborhood, I'm coming at you from a neighborhood with Riverside Church, which is no longer packed with parishioners, and St. John the Divine, which is no longer packed with parishioners, and Union Theological, where Niebuhr was, where they built a fancy rental housing right in the middle of their courtyard. St. John the Divine, and JTS, for that matter, Jewish Theological, they all sold off land to have luxury condos built. Yeah, so it's fascinating how that's sort of dying.
So in your book, you talk about your own turn toward Judaism, and it didn't start with your wife, who is the daughter of a rabbi. It really preceded that. Can you say where you think it started?
So on some level, I don't know, because it just kind of bubbled up from somewhere, I'm thinking about this, an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm that you may have seen, where there's these, liberal Hollywood Jews, and there's an intermarriage happening, and Larry David screws up in various typical ways such that the wedding can't take place because he messes everything up. And then
I don't think I've seen this.
And then after this happens, everybody comes up to him and says, "You're such a great man. Will you speak at my child's bar mitzvah," etc. Because they were sort of pretending to be untribal, but they actually were tribal on some level. So I don't know where that comes from, but it's there. And the other would be kind of the lure of the forbidden. This was all so tightly sealed away that it had a kind of fascination for me. What is behind the closed door? What would I find out if I opened it? Because it was just all stuff we were so afraid of.
So this is my question. I want to get back to your dad a little bit here. To what extent? I mean, I'm reading the book and I'm thinking about relatives of mine who also seem to have closed it off. And in my case, what I realized at a certain point, sometimes it was after they were dead, I'm talking my grandparents' generation, was that some of them were deeply suffering. I mean, it was the desire to not seem Jewish was a daily desire, much, and we know this from literature when we read books about Black people who want to pass. The fear that you might get found out as having, as what you are, Black, Jewish, whatever, was not a kind of one-time thing that you shut away. I mean, it was, and your first wife, of course, like there was a marriage where part of the deal was we'll just never speak of your mother having been a Jew. And gosh, I got a call when I used to do the podcast for Tablet Magazine. I got a call from someone I'd gone to college with who in her 20s had just discovered both of her parents were Jewish. And she'd been raised in an Episcopal church, and she'd gone to a very fancy perhaps New England boarding school, one of the 2 or 3 fanciest that one could name. And they had made a deal when they got married, these 2 Jewish parents, to never speak, to become Protestants together and never speak of it. And they actually had not talked to their extended families. I mean, they'd raised their daughter in the 80s and 90s with a total lie. These relatives are dead or live too far away or were estranged or whatever. So now, there was nothing like that in my family. But when I think about people who are repressing it, my experience of them is that once you know what's going on, you realize they're suffering a great deal. that it's not actually a successful repression. It's a neurosis. It's an unsuccessful one, and therefore it's pain and painful. I couldn't tell when I was reading about your dad if he was feeling that, if there was a forbidden something calling out to him, or a repressed thing trying to pop its head up, or if it was a completely successful disappearance into his ancient Greek and his collection of antiquities.
Well, I thought, as per we were discussing earlier, my father was not like a therapy type guy.
Right.
But I think that he, as I look back on him, he kind of, first of all, passing doesn't really apply because we lived in this very, very, very provincial world where everybody had known everybody for at least 3 generations. So if you sort of popped up one day and said, I'm not Jewish, everybody would say,
they would have said, what are you talking about?
Right. Just as my relatives in Donaldsonville, who are all Catholic now, are still regarded as Jewish, in the town.
Right.
So they weren't trying to pass, but they were trying to scrub themselves of anything that would read as, quote, too Jewish, or you're one of the bad Jews and not one of the good Jews. And so I think in my father's case, he did things that I now see as Jewish manqué. Like, as you mentioned, he studied ancient texts with a religiously trained person every week devotedly for decades. It was just that the person was a Catholic priest and the texts were the Iliad and the Odyssey, in ancient Greek. But he would just keep finding these sort of things to do that I now see as Jewish in some way, but, recast as not Jewish.
But if you'd said that to him, he would have said, what are you talking about? Right?
In his heyday, yes. In his very old age, he was much more willing to talk about stuff like that. And he might have said maybe. And he was also intensely aware of who was Jewish, who was not Jewish, who had intermarried, especially in the last years. He that was in his head all the time.
Right.
So it's this way.
Which it's not for a lot of...
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's
please.
At the surface, we have this very, very casual, normal, healthy, lightly held version of Jewishness. That's who we are. But it's very tightly clenched underneath the surface.
Right. There's also the ironic fact that and this is not so true in the kind of parochial New Orleans you're talking about, but in New York, say, if you stayed Jewish as a German Jew, you were at the top of the heap. Whereas if you tried to be a Protestant, you entered as a suspect Protestant. And I think one of the things going on with my grandparents was there was a lot more status they didn't intermarry, and there was status in being Jewish grandees. But there wouldn't have been any status at the Presbyterian Church. They just would have been another upper middle class Presbyterian. And by the way, they weren't even really Presbyterian. I mean, people kind of would have known that. And I remember there was a Downton Abbey story arc where one of the daughters, the Grantham daughters, is dating a guy who's Jewish, a sort of Montefiore, Disraeli kind of type, but Jewishly affiliated. So, more Montefiore. And when he decides to marry her or court her, his father is furious because he said it's basically to marry into this wealthy aristocratic Anglican family would be a huge come down. They're just one of 1,000 peerage families. You're one of the top 2 or 3 Jewish families.
Yeah, my father felt very comfortable and aligned with people like the Sassoons and the Ifrusis. That would be that's a form of Jewish association that he felt very comfortable with. He didn't actually know these people, but that was kind of his lane.
Right. You've been listening to the first part of my interview with Nicholas Lemann, the author of Returning, A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries. If you're tired of listening to me, if you want to stop listening and just have some silence and just read something, just have a quiet moment with your mint julep on your sofa, just reading, Well, obviously, you should go to our website, arcmag.org. We have some really cool stuff over at the website right now. We have Paul Bauman's review of Ian Baruma's new book about life in wartime Berlin. We have Nomi Kaltman's report from Australia about how the social media ban for teenagers is going over there. Australia has banned social media for kids. And, well, that's something we should do. But she reports on how it's gone over there in Australia. Valerie Pavlonis, who is a young practicing Catholic living in New York City, has a review of the new conversion memoir by our vice president, J.D. Vance. She is somebody who is herself Catholic, writing about this book by a baby Catholic, otherwise known as the vice president. And, well, she has some things to say about it. And just posted, we have a wonderful long piece by Brian Francis Slattery, who is my buddy and is a bluegrass musician as well as being a fantasy novelist. And he has, for his sins, read the Turner Diaries, the famous neo-Nazi, white supremacist, racist novel that inspired Timothy McVeigh and other domestic terrorists. In his essay, he says this book is so bad, it's hard to believe people think it's dangerous. Anyway, all of that and much more over at arcmag.org. That's arcmag.org. And now, back to the podcast. I want to get back to your journey a little bit. Like, to what extent did, both of your wives have been Jewish, and you did say that you just, when you would discover a woman whom you were interested in was Jewish, that would lend a little extra frisson, a little extra, excitement. And a lot of your Harvard friends were Jewish. And of course, the Crimson at the time must have been majority Jewish, the student newspaper. And how aware were you that I'm doing something? I mean, you said there was a little bit of the transgressiveness. How aware were you? I'm doing something Dad would be really pissed off about, or I'm putting distance.
Yeah, I was very, very aware of that. Extremely aware, and I was doing all this out of New Orleans, but as is in the book, this kind of came to a head when my oldest child, who's now 41, was bar mitzvahed, and my parents were extremely upset that this was happening. Fortunately, it was happening a long way from New Orleans, but that was the most overt tension I ever had with my parents that I can remember, was over that, because it was so unacceptable and upsetting.
So that's an interesting point, because they can tell themselves all sorts of stories about how they want to live their own life, but they didn't think of themselves as self-loathing or anti-Semitic. And here you're doing this thing that's perfectly normative Judaism. What was the story they were telling you about why they were so upset?
Well, I guess the way to explain, remember that the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 was essentially renounced in 1937. And this is the sort of Constitution of Reform Judaism. 1937 was the Columbus Platform, which tore up the Pittsburgh Platform. And since then, the Reform movement has become much more, Zionist and observant and all those things. So I think my father, on this and many things, he was very Southern, very conservative, and he would have thought the Pittsburgh Platform had it exactly right, and I am a good, loyal Pittsburgh Platform Jew. And yes, it was renounced 30 years earlier, but I still think it had it right, So that was, and he had it in his head that could be preserved, like a lot of other things about the world he grew up in. So I think that's his vision of himself, not self-hater, et cetera, but, adherent to the one true path of being Jewish in America.
I mean, to some extent, we all idealize the version of something we grew up with. And the fact that the world is ever changing is a kind of constant insult, right? So I think about I was coming up in college in the Clinton years, which really were the golden era for Jews. I mean, Clinton liked Jews, and the Oslo Accords happened. It seemed like Palestine was going to be solved, and the elite campuses were still, probably never a third Jewish, but probably 15 to 25%. There was a really healthy Jewish population at a lot of the schools Jews went to. It just felt so comfy. And also a lot of the Jews I knew came, and these again were people from more ethnic families than mine. They came from like Great Neck and Brookline and Winnetka, and they knew lots of other Jews, and they had a kind of like, they weren't quite out of a Philip Roth, but they weren't quite out of Goodbye Columbus, Defender of the
Yeah.
Jews, but they were like so comfortable, like arguing and interrupting and being fun, and also like guys who would wear Star of David. I'm not a jewelry person myself, but like, some of them were like from neighborhoods were like all like they really went to 40 B'nai Mitzvah their 7th or 8th grade year. And now I look at college campuses and even the Jews, it's like that culture's gone too. And part of it is they don't come from Jewish neighborhoods, which have really broken up. Like the neighborhoods, Upper West Side, for example, which used to be heavily Jewish, are not. And so even the ones who are very either religiously proud or Israel proud, they don't feel like the kind of thick, again, somewhat psychoanalytic, somewhat argumentative intellectual culture that I went to college with. And I guess part of the lesson is we all idealize some period, much as your father idealized like a certain kind of German Jewry, cavalier German Jewry, and we think that can stay, and nothing stays.
Yeah. So, and that's all of what you said, particularly the part about the neighborhoods. I think my prediction is that, and I think it's already happening, robust Jewish culture in America is going to be more show-based in the future. Because you can't just kind of be Jewish in a comfortable way in the current environment, because it's just way too charged. I mean, maybe it's a moment that'll fade, but it is really charged. I find at Columbia, Hillel is full of kids. Chabad, which is right out my window, is full of kids, but they tend to be more from observant backgrounds,
Yes.
Girls in skirts below the knee and things like that.
I think there are other things that go on here too. And now I'm sort of out of my pundit comfort zone, but the old joke that your Judaism could be Seinfeld and bagels or Mel Brooks and bagels. Frankly, I mean, just to kind of drill down on it, there's no Mel Brooks or Seinfeld in the current culture. I mean, there were 50 years where if you were trying to access a culture-based Judaism, well, guess what? Culture was Jewish.
No, I'm thinking about my friend David Denby's recent book called Eminent Jews, if you know that book.
Yeah. I didn't read it, but yeah, he looked at 4 Jews. He looked at Betty Friedan and Norman Mailer.
Mel
and
Brooks.
Who were the other two? Mel Brooks.
But the point of that book is, I see that as kind of what doesn't exist anymore. They're not like Kirk Douglas and Lauren Bacall from another generation, that is Jews who sort of present as non-Jewish. They're Jews who present as super Jewish, and they're loved for it, and their culture, they're heroes, and their culture is the mainstream American culture, and they don't have to do anything Jewish. They're secular, they're intermarried, they don't raise their kids as Jews, and it's all great, Leonard Bernstein conducting in Israel, so that, I think that world has just gone really suddenly since October 7th. That's just not a thing anymore, and we have to adjust to that.
Well, so interesting that that's not where I thought you were going with that. It was, I think you'd agree, it was probably already dying and coming apart. The culture had moved on. And frankly, Jews are taken to be white people, even when they're not. And kind of whiteness got decentered in cultural production, in Hollywood, in publishing for a good decade. But then October 7th happens, and all of a sudden, any kind of ambient cultural sense that having a Jewish patina to your life or being was cool is just shattered. It's not cool anymore. It's suspect. It's reactionary.
It's even, I think, more disturbing and weirder than that, because, there's this kind of syllogism. Since racism is the ultimate sin, anti-Semitism is a form of racism. So no one is anti-Semitic. I live in this sort of surreal world where no one's anti-Semitic, but Zionism is also racist. So you have to separate Zionism and Judaism completely, and Israel and American Judaism completely, in order for the world to make sense. Now, if you're Jewish, it feels like it's an iteration on the old theme of somebody else is creating a set of categories and a way of understanding you that just doesn't land with you. just seems like, what planet are you living on? But
Right.
I mean, people are constantly have been saying to me at Columbia over these last years, you don't understand that Jewishness and Zionism are unrelated. Theodore Herzl was this crazy wacko guy who came up with this idea in 1896 that had nothing to do with the entire Jewish tradition. And it was just like this weird, bad accident that it, took flight. And that's how non-Jews on the left and many Jews choose to understand Jewish identity and the Jewish story. So it's very weird to live in that environment.
So how do you, I mean, I know how I've handled it or mishandled it. How do you handle, the sort of 29-year-old assistant professor who doesn't know Jewish history, also was born in 2000, late 90s, doesn't remember a kind of thick Jewish American culture, and for the first time in a century came up in academia without knowing a lot of Jews. This was not have been possible even 1920 or 40 or 60. There were Jews and crypto Jews around. Now you meet these people for whom the intellectual life is not coded remotely Jewish. And they say incredibly insensitive things, assuming that there's no Jew in the room. Or if there is, it's a kind of Jew who's, of course, a good anti-Zionist lefty or whatever. And you're there surrounded as like the sane person in an insane world.
Right. Or a more extreme version, they come out into the public square in the university to say, I'm Jewish and I can tell you that there's no anti-Semitism here. There's that phenomenon.
Right.
But yeah, I've had that conversation with exactly the people.
I mean, do you shut it down? Do you have a strategy for it? I'm actually looking for some self-help guidance here. Like, how's it gone?
It's been a very intense, complicated experience. As you may know, I was the co-chair of Columbia's Task Force on Anti-Semitism, which was about the most stressful experience of my whole life. And it's over now, but I didn't think it, I didn't have a lot of conversations with people, with a couple of exceptions that ended in a place of at least some understanding. A couple of times, people in that category that you're talking about would end by saying, I'm never going to be a Jew the way you are. I'm never going to go to shul. I'm never going to do anything Jewish, but I kind of understand where you're coming from as something other than just straight up racism. But that's kind of as far as one could get. In some circles, in connection with the book, I'm out on the Borscht Belt, so to speak. I go to shuls a lot, and I don't have this conversation there. And it's, you can have a conversation about Israeli politics that doesn't feel intensely uncomfortable, and like you're being tested. You're one of the good Jews or one of the bad Jews. And we're all, as you know, we're all wrestling with this stuff, but it just feels more comfortable to wrestle with it inside the family than out in the outside world. In a lot of precincts I'm in, Zionism is now, I mean, something I hear sometimes from colleagues at Columbia, what the abolitionist movement in the 19th century is what the anti-Zionist movement in the 21st century is. They are exact equivalents. And that's how they understand life.
Are these colleagues who say this to you?
Yes.
So these are people, and again, I've been a PhD long enough to not put much stock in PhDs, but that kind of reductionism, even for people who, even allowing that there are absolutely sincere ways to be anti-Zionist and to criticize Israel, that level of reductionism doesn't seem like something a smart person can say. I mean, are you able to maintain your respect for them when their worldview is so thoroughly collapsed into this kind of ahistorical, knee-jerk, bigoted muddle? Like
it's a whole different kind of people and set of cultural touch points, but it feels very much like growing up in New Orleans, where you just think, this might be a perfectly nice person, but they're just not able to, you can't discuss anything Jewish with them because the level of not getting it is just so profound. I think the word anti-Semite to me has become decreasingly useful. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Around universities, we use the term with great ease and confidence, unconscious bias. And I think that's a thing, and I'm comfortable using that. It doesn't tend to be used in this instance, but I think it applies a lot in this instance.
Well, that's interesting. It should be. Right.
So
right.
people just say things constantly that are, like, really? You just said that? And they don't think of themselves. They think of themselves as totally not anti-Semitic in any way. Some of their best friends are Jews. Many of their best friends are Jews, etc. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And then they'll kind of drop a stunningly insensitive remark or ignorant.
Right.
So in a university, there's this kind of weird cognitive dissonance between, on the one hand, a cult of standards and expertise that is almost fanatical and absurd, but it's a cult. And then there are these kind of waves of super moralism that sweep across, and they vary over time. One day it's the post George Floyd stuff. One day it's anti-Zionism, but whether you know anything about it, you adopt it, And so an analogy I like to use is climate change. Like if I say, Mark, is climate change real? You're probably going to say yes. And then I'm going to say, okay, give me a 10-minute technical explanation of exactly how it works. I don't know you well. I'm guessing
you can rest assured
you can't do it.
I would not succeed.
So what?
you guess right.
So why do you know climate change is real? It's because the people you respect think it's real, and it's a heuristic to say, I have the ability to opine on things I don't really know about because I absorb the views of people I respect in the world. And it's especially, in a sort of Northeastern academic culture, you're supposed to have a hot take on everything,
Right.
And so anti-Zionism has sort of gone into that category where everybody's against it because the people they respect are against it. But if you quiz them on the history of Zionism in Israel, they're not going to be able to do it, But it's received wisdom, and it just happens so fast.
And I think it's gotten worse because the need to have a hot take, after Trump's first election, a lot of people really did begin to believe that remaining silent because you acknowledge your own ignorance was a political failure. You were supposed to have a take on everything. And, silence equals violence, that whole notion. And so the idea that you would say, actually, I don't know enough about this to say, or not my cup of tea, became coded as this sort of quietist reactionary move. And so you had all of these people. I mean, I think 40 years ago, the Columbia and Yale English departments were overwhelmingly liberal Democrats, but they didn't necessarily have a take on everything. And now the expectation that you sign the petition and that you have a take is overwhelming, which, then comes along to destroy organizations like Penn or the Poetry Society or whatever, where all of a sudden, who doesn't know anything about Zionism is people who sit around all day writing short stories. I mean, some of them do, but if you wanted to design a life that would expose you to Zionism and make you somewhat expert on it, it probably wouldn't be the life of a fiction writer or a literary journalist who covers other stuff or whatever. They're not political scientists. They're not, whatever. So, and yet all of these people all of a sudden had to have takes and had to sign the petition.
Yeah. I mean, abstract painters, that's an even more extreme example.
Do you have your book with you? Can I ask you to read a passage?
I have to get it out of the closet.
Okay, go get it. Go get it. All right. While Nick Lemann goes and hunts for that book on his shelves, I want to take another break in the middle of this podcast to tell you about a new podcast. You might call it our sister podcast or brother podcast. We are welcoming to the ARC audio family a podcast called Eminent Americans. It is hosted by the wonderfully named Daniel Oppenheimer, and yes, there is some relation. Eminent Americans is a bit of a cult classic among American podcasts. It has a very loyal following. It's sort of like my podcast in that it's interviews with interesting people, many of them writers, but I would say it's even smarter The episodes are often even longer. And he is really trying to talk to the people who are, in fact, eminent Americans, as the podcast title goes, in the sense that they are the ones who are telling us what to think and how to think. In other words, Daniel Oppenheimer in this podcast is looking to find the undercurrent of American intellectual life. Let me give you an example. In one episode, he interviews the writer Jacob Siegel about American masculinity. Jacob had written an essay called The Disappearing American Man, and he and Dan talk about how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have contributed to a crisis of American masculinity. In another episode, he talks to the political scientist Damon Linker. One episode that I really love is his conversation with the Native American novelist Sherman Alexie. They talk about the emotional comfort food of genre television. They both grew up watching a lot of TV, and they talk about how that forms one's brain. It's a nerdier, brainier podcast than mine, and I strongly encourage you to go subscribe to Eminent Americans. You can do it through our website over at arcmag.org, or, of course, you can go to the usual places over at Spotify, Apple Music, or Substack, where the podcast is hosted. We are so pleased to welcome Eminent Americans to the family of ARC podcasts. And now, back to my interview with Nicholas Lemann.
Anyway, I have the book now.
Oh, good. So a part that I just found very moving and that I related to was the first full paragraph beginning on 309, the only paragraph that begins on 309 as the years passed. I thought maybe you'd read that paragraph.
Okay. As the years passed, I'd go to a synagogue sometimes for a friend's child's bar mitzvah. This is when I'm in my 30s. My first marriage, two small children living in the suburbs in New York. At a crucial point in every Saturday morning service, the ark would be opened, everyone would stand, the Torah scroll would be brought out, and someone would walk it around the room so that everyone could symbolically kiss it. A quick touch of the prayer book or the fringe of the tallis, first to the scroll, then to the lips. After this display of reverence, the scroll, hand-calligraphed parchment made of stitched-together animal skins, would be laid down on a podium and opened, and the rabbi would read that week's portion aloud in a special incantation. At a bar mitzvah, it would be the spindly child, dressed up more fancily than on any previous occasion, who would be called up and handed the staggeringly heavy Torah scroll. Before beginning the procession around the room, the child would intone the essential Jewish prayer, the Shema. And at that point, unbidden, I would burst into helpless. At that point, unbidden, I would burst into helpless tears, struggling to keep it quiet enough not to be noticed. Now, let me interrupt myself here, and before I read the next paragraph. One of the people I asked to read the book in manuscript was a wonderful colleague named Farrah Griffin, who's the head of the Columbia Black Studies Department. And she came back to me and said, you need to write a new paragraph after that paragraph to explain why you were having this emotion, because I don't understand it. And so this paragraph is credit to Farrah. What was happening? Why the dramatic effect? Access to this aspect of Jewish life, to this aspect of Jewish life, of the lives of my family going back hundreds of years, through an unimaginable variety of circumstances, had been shut off to me, as firmly as a metal door being welded shut. That must have upset me a great deal, even though I wasn't consciously aware of being upset about it. Now the door was open. I was weeping over the poignancy of my parents' doomed hope that other doors would open if they closed this one. Over how liberating it felt to permit myself the luxury of particularism, of membership in a people, instead of having to insist that whatever I felt and wanted was an expression of universal values aimed at the benefit of all. Over submitting to the undeniable power of ancient pre-rational wisdom.
Um, yeah, I stopped on those two paragraphs, and
Yeah,
I understood intuitively. I mean, I'm
right.
glad you're with the second paragraph, but I also got the first one, and I think a lot of people wouldn't, including a lot of people really smart, people whom I love. But what? Let me. You do explain it, but you end on that sentence of where you say the undeniable power of ancient pre-rational wisdom, and a good place to maybe stop is to ask about rationalism and irrationalism. Among other things, people who are brought up in secular universalism or universalist secularism really prioritize the rational, and metaphysical belief or irrational belief, let's call it irrational belief, is seen as a kind of moral failure almost, or some sort of intellectual failure. Um, how, so therefore, when you start to get moved by religious ritual, as I did at a certain age, there's a kind of shame that comes with it, as if you're abandoning the rationalism and the education even that you were privileged to be given. I mean, these people send you to good schools, they send you to Harvard, and then what? You're going to like take 4 hours on a Saturday to like listen to Aramaic that you don't understand? Do you think that there's something irrational at work here, or do you think there's something that's metaphysical, just beyond that will never be reduced to neurons firing? Or is it enough to say that, the way we've evolved also allows for this kind of emotion in the world?
Here are two non-Jewish books that probably had the most profound effect on me in middle age. Um, and it'll seem weird that I say this. One is a book that is very hard to get through called The Process of Government by Arthur Bentley. And one is the really boring, skippable Theory of History parts toward the end of War and Peace. And in both cases, they really undercut the idea that people are capable of transcending any kind of tribal or particularist or interest identity, that they have this sort of mega awareness of the world. So I don't think it's irrational so much as it's rational to think I'm not always right. It's okay to be a member of a tribe. It's okay to uh, interact with reverence with the Torah. That doesn't mean you're abandoning rationality. Um, and it's also, as in what I read, I've come to see the Jewish tradition as incredibly rich and uh, meaningful. And it seems sort of hubris to say, oh, shit, let's just throw that whole thing out because it doesn't matter anymore in the modern world, and it also doesn't matter if, my family was observantly Jewish for 50 generations, but those days are over. You have an obligation to continue the tradition. And, I've had a couple of encounters while promoting the book, where people say, well, I understand why you read Torah because it's a profound moral document and it tells you, gives you instruction. And I say to those people, you don't read Torah that much, do you? Like you read the 10 Commandments, and that's about it. And one of the ways that Torah is very useful in this charged moment we're in is it's so problematic. You know, we meet Abraham. He pimps out his wife to Pharaoh and says she's his sister. Then he offers his son as a human sacrifice. Then he okays the banishment of his illegitimate son to the desert by his wife, who urged him to have the illegitimate son. And by the way, God doesn't look too good either. So the whole tradition is wrestling with really complicated stuff, and it's an argument, a discussion, an interpretive process that never ends. And, there's a reason it's lasted so long. Religion is deeply misunderstood in our secular culture, at least our religion, as being a sense of sort of simplistic, anti-scientific, anti-rational verities that you're supposed to follow, and a succession of perfect people that you're supposed to, model yourself on. It's not that, as you know.
Your sister's a writer. She's a novelist. What does she think of all this? Where is she on these questions?
She's interesting because she's much, much closer to where our father was. I mean, I think she's much closer to thinking our father had it right. She married, interestingly, a Eastern European descended, much more observant Jewish guy who, quasi keeps kosher and stuff like that. Their two daughters were bat mitzvahed, but my sister's always pushing. She wanted, why can't I serve shrimp at the Seder and stuff like that. So she's kind of in a not the same place as me, but sort of in between place where she's a novelist, and she's like the rare Jewish novelist who typically mentions in one sentence in her novels that she's
Uh-huh.
Jewish, and then that's it. She's not like
Right.
a Jewish novelist like a Philip
Right.
Roth or something.
Has anyone, and this might be the letters you've gotten about the book, but it might have been people who've come up to you at talks. Has anyone really hated it? Has anyone thought
There was
it
one.
rubbed someone the wrong way in an interesting way?
So there was only one, knock on wood, bad reaction that I've gotten so far, and it was interesting because I gave a talk at a book festival in Oxford, Mississippi, at the legendary independent bookstore there, Square Books. And in the question period, a guy gets up, and first he says, my daughter is a student at Columbia School of Social Work, and how can you justify participating in the abolition of free speech and academic freedom at your university? So we go there. And then he says, you've written your whole life about racism in the South. Israel is so much worse than anything that happened in the South during slavery and during the Reconstruction and during the Jim Crow period. It's so much worse, so much more indefensible, and yet you have remained silent. Why? So that was the one outlier reaction that I've gotten.
Let's talk before we conclude about the guild that we're both in, journalism and writing and literature. I've kind of despaired at how many stupid things writers I've respected have said about Jews or Israel in the past couple years. Is it all hopeless? Is it just going to be the shibboleth forever that there has to be a kind of sort of collective groupthink around this that really squashes actual debate and conversation, that it's going to become part of like membership in the guild, that you have to think one way on this topic?
I'm not sure. As I said before, these kind of waves of moralism sweep across our world and then they recede a bit. So we're definitely in one of those waves. It may recede, but there are lots of spaces where you can write, more honestly about this stuff, or so I have found. And to some extent, I'm blessed by the fact that this is happening at the end of my career in journalism. So I don't have to deal with this for my whole life. I can just take what years I have left and write about whatever I want. And that's a great luxury. I don't need to sort of think about it systemically. But I suspect the worm will turn at least a little bit, just because I've been a journalist for over 50 years, and I've watched a bunch of these spikes. And starting with when I first, was a freshman at Harvard, Richard Nixon is the most right-wing fascist person that could ever be imagined. And they do tend to sort of come down from the peak. I have been teaching, I don't teach about this at all, but I have been teaching for many years a kind of methodology on how to be a little more rigorous in your journalism and not swallow the conventional wisdom. It's not subject specific. And I think it makes an impact on my students. What if you're wrong? Could you be wrong? How could you be wrong? These are not things journalists naturally do intellectually, but it's really useful. And the self-interested way to put it is you're going to get a better story if you're willing to leave the tight confines of the conventional wisdom and come up with
But it
something
also
new.
requires of them that their romance be with getting the best story and not with promoting social justice. If they're going into the field because it's their version of social work or activism, then they're not going to be good at it. And that's...
Yeah, sometimes they are, but I hear you. I read applications to Columbia Journalism School every year, and almost all of them, there's a question of why do you want to go into journalism, and they almost all say to promote social justice. And then at graduation time, I say, the biggest news organization in the world is Bloomberg, and they say, So yeah, students just love the idea that they're the crusader against moral wrong, understood very simply. And I try to make some progress on that, but it's I wouldn't use Israel as the test case because the resistance would be just total there.
All right, I always conclude with 4 very quick questions that need 5-second answers, but you can take as long as you want to think about it. So the first is actually very apposite. Do you believe in God? And if so, what do you mean by that?
So as I have gotten deeper into the Jewish world, I have discovered there's lots of forms of reverse chic. And one of the forms in the observant Jewish world is to say, I don't believe in God. And Judaism isn't a religion and things like that, that I'm sure you've encountered. And what that means is it's a thick set of practices that, form the boundaries of your life and a participation in a community that's very deep. And one of the things we do in our community all the time is talk about this guy named God, who's the sort of character in the Torah. But we can do that in a kind of irreverent way and not, quote, believe in him. So I'm not all the way there. So I would say, but anything I said about my belief in God would sound like really reformed to people. Like it's a name that we give and a personification that we give to the attempt to make humanity, which is so flawed, a little bit better. Something like that.
Is there a song that takes you back to a particular moment in a really nice way, that nostalgically? And if so, name one.
Well, this came up in another podcast.
Someone stole my idea, my question. That came from in me.
No, okay, it wasn't about a song, but anyway, it was like, when did your Jewish journey begin? And so I was remembering, this isn't the example you would be looking for, but when I was a kid, there was this kind of novelty record that was in the beginning of this, or during this period we were talking about before, when Jewish culture was more mainstream. And I'm sure you've heard this song. You may be too young to have experienced the record, but everybody was listening to it. So it's this song, Hello, Mata, hello, Fada, here I am at Camp Granada.
Alan Sherman. I owned the LP, the vinyl record. I don't know why. I don't know if my parents had bought it, if my grandparents had bought it, but I remember the cover of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And everybody had it. So somehow, not at home, of course, I heard that song, and I must have been 8 years old or something. And I thought, there's something about this song that is Jewish. I can't put my finger on it, but it just registers that way. And what is it? And so that's kind of an early memory that came to me after I finished the book of a Jewish cultural reference point.
I love that. If you hadn't become a journalist, what's another road not taken career-wise? What might you have loved to do?
Well, I once said to my mother, I wrote, when I was young, I worked for this wonderful magazine called Texas Monthly. And I wrote a long piece about the Texas Medical Center in Houston. I must have been 25. And said to my mother after I wrote it, I think I might have liked being a doctor. She said, next time just take a dagger and stab me in the heart. Because she was so upset that I had chosen to become a journalist. So I think I would like being a doctor, maybe. I don't know if I'd be good at it. I'm not that science forward.
Is there a bit of advice you would give to a college graduate or a young person who just wants a bit of advice?
Follow your dreams. Let's see. What advice would I give? It kind of goes back to some of the material I've been teaching. If you can train yourself to engage in a non-automatic thought process that is how you make decisions about your own life and how you make decisions about what to think about other things, that is really, really useful.
And then finally, what's a book or other work of art? Maybe it's a movie, maybe it's an opera, something that you recommend that you just think people would love.
Well, there's a book that really helped me to write this book, which is another book by a Columbia colleague, Negro Land by Margot Jefferson. And Margot, the reason it resonated is she grew up in this very in-between world. She grew up in Hyde Park, Chicago, as part of the, super elite part of Black Chicago. And so on the one hand, she's kind of in range of the white elite, but not quite a member. And then on the other hand, there's the Black migration going on when she's growing up. And she has some relation to the Black mass, but she wouldn't, they weren't invited to her home. And she had to kind of work herself out what was her identity in between these two groups, because her own identity was so tightly bounded. And I think it's a wonderful evocation of that process, which is similar to my process.
I never read that book, but I should. I like her writing. Nicholas Lemann, Returning, A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
That's me talking a couple months ago with Nicholas Lemann about his book, Returning, A Search for Home Across 3 Centuries. Such a delight to have Nick on the podcast. I encourage you all to read the book. And of course, if you're not yet a subscriber to this podcast, please become one. This podcast is produced by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at WashU in St. Louis. It wouldn't be possible without my deputy and editor, David Sugarman, and our colleagues at the Danforth Center. They include Abram Van Engen, Sherry Pena, Shelley Mitchum, and others. Remember to go sign up for Eminent Americans, our new podcast, and I will see you all soon. Thanks so much.